Chapter 25. Red Seal Base, Antarctica. "Useless!" Clear shouted, and swept the desk clear of printouts, pens, and calculators. "Useless!" She kicked her chair and sent it rolling into the wall hard enough to dent the plaster. The action wasn't even satisfying. The huge weight of rock and ice above her seemed to swallow her anger, and the antiseptic air of the base seemed to muffle even the sound of her scream. Inside her brain, the computer governors worked to calm her. But Clear resisted, unleashing a seemingly bottomless well of fight-or-flight chemicals into her bloodstream. "Useless, stupid machine!" She thought at her own computer. Why didn't it have the information that she needed? Where was the program that would turn Skynet from a sophisticated toy into a sentient being? Why hadn't it been included? She had useless information to burn, but the one tiny clue she so desperately needed was missing. A murmur of quantum formula ran through the mechanical part of her brain, and she dismissed it with fury. "We're so close," she thought, feeling herself calm as her computer succeeded in getting her brain chemistry under control. But diminishing the strength of her frustration didn't erase it. She stood with her hands on her hips, glaring at the computer screen and its offending lines of text. Then she began to pace like a caged tigress. "Your lack of self-control does you no credit," Kurt Weimeister said coldly. He hadn't looked up when she'd swept her desktop clear, and he didn't look up as he spoke. But his posture and his fixed expression revealed his disapproval as loudly as any words. "You idiot human," Clear thought bitterly, turning her glare on him. "I thought you were the one that made Skynet live." Unfortunately, the work he'd been producing proved that he wasn't. And even more unfortunately, neither was she. She shook her head in disgust and turned away. "Where the hell are you going?" Weimeister shouted at her back. She turned at the door of the lab to snap, "Your lack of self-control does you no credit, Kurt." Then, with a look of profound contempt, she turned away. Petty, perhaps, but satisfying. Unlike anything else in her life right now. Clear went directly to her room. She needed desperately to get away from humans, or she might just have to kill one. "I should not terminate any humans at this point. It would be non-mission optimal. But what if I simply must kill someone?" She slammed the door behind her, then paced the small space for half an hour, burning off the rest of the bad chemistry. The hormones had sunk into muscle tissue as well as her brain. Finally, she threw herself down on the bed, covering her eyes with her forearm. It was time to calm down and to start thinking. She decided to take a few moments to check on her seals. Seal vision was not the best, and she regretted that she hadn't made some provision to enhance what they saw. But if they saw anything really interesting, her internal computer could sharpen the images for her. What she saw through their eyes might be almost as boring as the base, but it was a change of scenery, which, after too many weeks in this lockbox, she needed now and again. While she watched, courtesy of her implants, the vague shapes of penguins toddling about in the distance, Clea idly wished that she could talk to Alyssa. But the Terminator she had managed to contact while out on the ice had informed her that her sibling was undergoing the growth process and was unavailable. Alyssa would probably remain unavailable for at least another week, depending on how hard she was pushing herself. The I-950 sighed and changed her input to another seal for more blurred views of rock, ice, water, and penguins. Then sat bolt upright in surprise. What she was looking at was a small group of humans loading up a sledge. Making the seal look around, she caught sight of a Zodiac plying its way to a dimly perceived ship of some kind in the distance. Well, well, she thought. Who is this? New arrivals for the base. Why not helicopter them in the way they did everything else from supplies to scientists? Maybe they're not coming to the base. But what else was out there? A skewer, going by the general size and shape, knocked the smallest human down, and Clea laughed aloud. She'd had that happen to her once. Thereafter, she'd amused herself by knocking the skewers out of the air. It was a pity she hadn't been able to catch one to implant with her little chips. But they'd all been dead when she retrieved them. Besides, the chips were designed for mammalian nervous systems, and an avian one might not be able to support the machinery. Avians were, literally, bird brains. Still, she longed for the kind of clear vision a flying predator might provide. The humans finished their packing and headed inland. Clea watched them go, chewing her lower lip indecisively. Then, on impulse, she sent 4 of her 7 seals after them. At the very least, they'd be something different to watch. Besides, she suspected that at this moment she knew more about the situation than Tricker did, for there had been no incoming communique warning of new arrivals. Perhaps it's a surprise inspection, she thought. In which case, she could arrange to be on hand to witness Tricker's discomfort. The idea gave her a nice feeling of power. It was a fairly nice summer's day in Antarctica. The temperature must be around 35 or so, Wendy thought. There was only a gentle breeze stirring the air, and the sky was a light blue-grey, indicating a high overcast. She was merely miserably, uncomfortably cold, instead of freezing as she'd expected. The scenery around them was ice and hard-packed snow, wind sculpted into weird and graceful shapes, like a Salvador Dali painting in monochrome. Sometimes a mound of snow would heave up like a wave frozen as it crested, frilled with a lacy edging of clear ice sparkling on its underside. In the distance, cliffs of ice seemed to bear tiny ruffles of white and blue and pale emerald green. More than once, the beauty of the place took her breath away. The three of them were dressed all in white. The sledge wore a white tarpaulin, and the snowmobile was painted pure white as well. It's Ghost Troop, she thought. It seemed to her that very little here was really pure white. To Wendy's eye, they actually stood out against the shades of cream, blue-white, palest beige. Although the light was so flat it made things look strange, so that if anyone was watching, maybe they couldn't tell where they were going or how far away they were. Or even that we're here? Well, maybe that was too much to hope for. On the other hand, it's too cold out here to have people posted with nothing but a parka and a pair of binoculars for any length of time. Cameras would freeze, I suppose. Someone had told her that on the yacht. Antarctica was actually a worse environment for machinery than the moon. So the odds were good that they were unobserved. She looked up again. And that overcast, slight as it is, would obscure satellite observation, if there is any. So I guess we're safe. The sledge went over a bump and her teeth clomped together. Not comfortable, but safe. The plan was to travel at an easy pace for the next 2 days. They'd actually unpacked a stove to cook up some stew for lunch, which they'd eaten in the lee of the supply ledge, along with a whole loaf of bread. Wendy had tried to refuse the bread, but Dieter had buttered a huge slice thickly and put it into her hand. Eat it, he'd insisted. You're not going to get fat at the rate you're burning calories. So, reluctantly, she'd done so. And she did feel better for it. After lunch, John had slipped her a couple of chocolate bars, and she'd gobbled them up. Guilt-free chocolate, she thought happily. What a concept. She was already looking forward to supper. By the morning of their third day on the ice, as Wendy lay on her stomach staring at the hidden base's wind farm, all she was looking forward to was getting somewhere warm. Even if it was only for a little while. The sky had become completely overcast by late the first afternoon, and the temperature had plummeted accordingly, giving even the most expensive of their travel gear a harsh, and as far as she was concerned, not altogether successful test. Wendy had thought that as a New England girl, she'd be better able to endure the cold than John. She glanced at him. He seemed completely unfazed by the temperature, the hard travel, the cramped sleeping quarters, or what they were about to do. On the one hand, she admired him. On the other, she was convinced that they'd all gone barking mad. John turned to Wendy and gave her a thumbs up, smiling encouragingly as he did so, even though she couldn't see his grin. He couldn't see her expression either, since they were both wearing balaclavas and huge dark goggles, not to mention skin-protecting ointment that smelled bad and made them look like ghouls, 3 days dead. But he could tell by the position of her head that she was giving him a blank and puzzled look. She's so slender, an easy candidate for hypothermia. She seemed to be growing weaker too, despite all the chocolate and power bars and buttered bread they could force on her. He was looking forward to their day of rest, when she could languish in her sleeping bag inside the tent for as long as she wished. Not that it would be a visit to the tropics by any means, but it was a damn sight better than what she was experiencing now. Not that she'd uttered one word of complaint. Moved by her pluck, he gripped her shoulder, and she bent her head to touch her swaddled cheek to his gloved hand. Dieter recalled his attention by slapping his shoulder. The big Austrian signaled that there was no one around, and the little gizmo in his hand detected no listening devices. So why, John wondered, aren't we talking? Then he decided it wasn't worth asking. It seemed the cold was getting to him too. The two men rose and trundled over the gentle rise toward the windmills. The few supplies necessary for the sabotage were in insulated packs that they had stuffed inside their parkas to keep them from freezing. Time to take out the target. The windmills stood on a slight rise, where the basalt rock beneath crested up beneath the ice. The inhuman whine of their giant blades came whickering down through the frigid air, like a mechanical snarl beneath its chill. Why do operatives say things like terminate and take out, instead of kill and blow up? John asked. The business is hard enough as it is, Dieter answered. John unscrewed the panel that led to his first windmill's inner workings. Awkwardly, he attempted to unscrew the cap on the bottle he'd carried inside his jacket, and found it impossible. Stripping off the heavy outer gloves, he allowed them to dangle from cords attached to his sleeves, leaving only his polypropylene glove liners to protect him from the cold. Which, since that wasn't what they were designed for, they didn't. Almost immediately, his fingers began to go numb. But at least he could handle the small bottle. Removing the eyedropper top, he sprinkled a liquid onto the plastic seal at the top of the unit's hydraulic pump. The liquid was supposed to break up polymer chains, causing the seals to disintegrate. Putting the liquid back inside an inside pocket, he brought out a calculator-sized instrument that he would use to reprogram the windmill's computerized governor. He pulled out the motherboard and attached clips, then set to work. By the time he reinstalled it into its slot, the windmill was already pumping faster, spreading the damaging liquid, and on its way to dashing itself to pieces. Putting his glove back on, John screwed the protective panel back on and moved to the next one. There were 12 in all, modular units about 15 feet high, and built sturdy to survive the frequent high winds and the bitter cold. But no attempt had been made to protect them from sabotage. Why would there be? Who would be out here looking to commit acts of vandalism in Antarctica? Little old me, John thought. Just little old me. Well, and Dieter. Oops, looks like the big guy spilled some. Von Rossbach's glove liners were in shreds, where the liquid had touched them. John watched him peel them off, wincing at the heat caused by their destruction. It felt good at first, Dieter said when he noticed John watching him. But now it's burning. He shoved the ruined gloves into his breast pocket, then worked his reddened hands. Could just be the cold, he muttered, slipping his outer gloves back on. John looked around. Dieter was finished, and he was halfway through with his last one. Checking the watch attached to the outside of his sleeve, he raised his brows. Good job, he thought. They'd obviously allowed more time for this than was necessary. In less than 5 minutes, he was tramping up the low rise to rejoin Wendy. Behind him, the windmills had begun to run crazy, spinning like tops in the wind. Soon, the governors would burn out, and without the seals, so would the hydraulic pump, while the blades broke up under the stress. Which meant that the hidden base would be completely out of power in less than a day, turning the place into a deep freeze. But just in case the base had some other means of generating electricity, their next stop would be a visit to the water pumping station. Behind him, the level whine was grating higher, turning into a protesting squeal as the ultra-tough composites began to stress beyond their design parameters. Crack! Dieter and John both spun and began to drop, an automatic response to what their trained reflexes interpreted as an explosion. They completed the movement. One of the windmills had disintegrated, and lethal splinters might well reach across the 300 yards to the two men. Didn't think it would happen that fast, John said. Dieter looked up, brushing himself free of snow. The wind is picking up, he said. Must be nearly 50 by now. Wendy was already seated on the snowmobile, and when she saw them come over the rise, she started it up. The movement of her head looked a little wobbly to him, and her hand, as it reached for the starter, had seemed clumsy and slow. Suddenly, he noticed something he'd missed while working below. His haste had kept him relatively warm, but the temperature had dropped. And Dieter was right. It's getting to be storm level. John looked up at the sky and realized that the hurrying clouds were also thicker and more threatening. He glanced at Dieter. We'd better hurry if we're going to make it before this storm breaks. The Austrian looked from John to Wendy. I'll ride in front of Wendy to shield her from the wind, he offered. Also, I'll probably throw off more heat than you would. John nodded and headed for the sledge. As they rode away, he saw one of the blades on the second windmill fly off and strike the one behind it, breaking two of its blades and starting a chain reaction of destruction that brought a smile to his weary face. A job well done, he thought with satisfaction. After her blow-up in the Skynet lab, Clea had gone to her own lab to work on her abandoned projects. For one thing, it gave her more freedom to watch the three mystery travelers. For another, it gave her some relief from Weimeister's irritating possessiveness. He'd been avoiding her conspicuously in the cafeteria, which had given her an opportunity to meet some of the other scientists. To Kurt's great annoyance, which of course she enjoyed. His self-imposed distance meant he was less likely to burst in on her while she was spying on the travelers. A small bonus that did little to make up for the disappointment the human had caused her. One of the seals, the smallest, had dropped dead of exhaustion after nearly 36 hours of humping its way across the ice. The animals weren't designed for overland travel. It had made a useful snack for the others, though. Fortunately, the humans allowed themselves rest and meal breaks, and so the other three seals were able to keep up, though they were hardly thriving. The I-950 had begun to suspect where the travelers were heading several hours ago, and so she had let two of the animals rest while sending the third. And she hoped strongest one to watch the intruders. The humans stopped the snowmobile and hiked towards the top of a low rise. Just before they reached the top, the three of them dropped to their bellies and crawled the rest of the way. Well, Clea thought, that's significant. The only wildlife out there was behind them, watching their every move. So they certainly weren't naturalists being careful not to startle the animals. And geologists rarely felt compelled to sneak up on their objects of study. Just above the rise where the three humans lay, the seal's weak eyes made out a number of vague somethings, making sweeping, repetitive motions. The wind farm, the I-950 thought. I knew it. Unless she missed her guess, the base was about to become much, much colder and darker. I'm glad I've got Kurt's latest backup. He hadn't done much work since she left, but had sat brooding for the most part. Poor Kurt, she sneered. He has so little control of his emotions. Clea got up and shut down her lab, then headed for her quarters. She might as well get out her cold weather gear while the lights were still on. The lights flickered, and Tricker glared up at the fluorescence, as if in threat. Unimpressed, they went out. Shit, the agent muttered. He got up, feeling his way around his desk, and opened the door to the corridor. Outside, emergency lights provided dim illumination, and other doors began to open. Then the lights flickered again and went on. Less bright, but at least they were steady. Tricker went back to his office and his phone rang even as he reached for it. It was the base commander. We're on emergency power, she said crisply. According to the boys in the plant, the power from the wind farm fluctuated and then suddenly cut off. Well, what do you want me to do about it? Tricker thought. Since when am I an electrician? Though, to be fair, Having all the windmills stop producing electricity at the same time was suspicious, and suspicious events were his bailiwick. Depending on what's gone wrong, we might need to evacuate. She continued. If we cut back on our power consumption, we have up to 72 hours of fuel to run the emergency generator, or 36 at our present rate. He heard her breath hiss into the phone. If we're going to be gone, I need you to make this place secure. Do you understand? Duh. Yes, ma'am, he said briskly. You'll coordinate the evacuation with your counterpart at McMurdo, and you'll be responsible for the scientists' backup material. I don't want any sensitive material left around. It's in the manual, lady. Something I've had plenty of time to memorize, incidentally. Yes, ma'am, he said aloud. What about the weather? They're predicting a severe storm within 24 hours, the commander said. So it's important that we get our charges to safety if necessary. They're in good hands, Tricker said. Silence greeted his assurance. They had better be, she said coldly, then hung up. Bitch, he thought, and hung up the phone. He'd learned long ago not to indulge in open comments about a superior. Besides, he well knew that the entire base was wired for sound. He and the commander had duplicate recordings. But as yet they couldn't monitor his thoughts. Thank God. He turned off his computer and headed off to ride herd on the sometimes eccentric and often degenerate geniuses under his care. 4.5 hours later, his pager vibrated. A glance at the readout informed him that once again the commander wished to speak to him. I never thought I'd be happy to hear from her. But after spending the morning telling these people that they had to back up their work and erase their hard drives, he was ready for a break. He returned to his office, picked up the phone, and punched in her number. Tricker, he said when the phone was picked up. We have another problem, the commander told him. Tricker waited, feeling stubborn. If there was something to tell him, she should just spill it out, if he waited long enough. Meanwhile, he was in no particular hurry. The water pump has broken down, she explained, a slight edge in her voice. Tricker rubbed his face with his free hand. Sabotage? He wondered. Wait a minute. Wouldn't it shut down anyway, with the power off? The water pump has an independent system. We're sending someone out to investigate. What about the windmills? Tricker asked. Anybody gotten back to us on those? They're destroyed, she said. Her voice sounded thoughtful. My first thought is sabotage, he said honestly. As it should be. The commander sounded amused. However, initial investigation indicates that the seals were degraded. The investigator said they'd basically turned to powder. The windmills had nothing to control them, so when the wind rose, they just broke up. Do we have replacement parts? Not enough on hand to meet our power needs, she said. We didn't anticipate all the seals going at once, and then the rotors destroying themselves. So obviously the evacuation is on. Even if we had running water, which we don't, we couldn't stay here. Round 'em up, Mr. Tricker, and move 'em out. Just Tricker, he said impatiently. Then he realized she'd hung up. Excited, Clea decided to risk contact with home base. The humans would be busy with the power crisis, and so might miss the transmission. It was important that this information be passed on. To her surprise, Alyssa was awake. Are you well? Clea asked. As well as can be expected. I'm not yet fully mature. I estimate that I'm in the human equivalent of 15 years old. But I look adult with the right makeup and accessories. Excellent, Clea said. I have news. Silence greeted the announcement. Naturally, Clea thought, feeling embarrassed. She wouldn't have made contact for no reason. I've actually been around humans far too long if I expected a different reaction. I have reason to believe that von Rossbach and the Connors are here and busily performing acts of sabotage. What reasons? Alyssa demanded. Clea responded by showing her the crucial moment in a recording of her augmented SEAL's reconnaissance. A tall, slender figure, male by his movements, exited a shed, his face concealed by goggles and a balaclava. Behind him, a taller male came. This one's face was exposed, briefly, to the weather. Clea stilled the picture and allowed her computer to enhance it. Shadows and shapes refined and rearranged themselves until they resolved into the image of a T-101. Which, since she and her sister could account for every Terminator on Earth, meant that this was none other than Dieter von Rossbach. The recording began again, and in a few movements, von Rossbach's face was obscured by fabric and goggles. The two males walked over to a snowmobile to be joined by a smaller figure that was undoubtedly female. That was definitely von Rossbach, Alyssa agreed. Which means the younger male probably is John Connor. But the female is not Sarah Connor. Startled, Clea asked, Then who is she? There was a silence from her sister, and Clea realized she should have asked a different question. How can you tell? This woman's body is looser, indicating that she's much younger than Sarah Connor. Her shoulders are narrower as well. Alyssa froze a picture of the woman with her back turned towards the seal and superimposed an outline of Sarah Connor's body over her frame. There was a difference of 4 centimeters at the shoulders. Clea was dumbstruck. She knew without checking that there were only 3 humans in this party. If the female wasn't Sarah Connor, then where was she? She would never let her son come here on a mission so dangerous, Clea began. Unless she trusted von Rossbach implicitly, Alyssa finished. Meaning she may well be at his home. Going by Serena's recordings, Connor was badly wounded. She may still be recovering. She is, after all, only human. That makes my task a bit less daunting, Clea said. Good, her sister replied. You deal with these invaders. I will deal with Sarah Connor. At the water pumping station, they treated the plant's independently functioning windmill the same as the others, then carefully burned out the conductors for the heating system, causing the water to begin freezing in the pipes. Soon those pipes would burst, far underground, where they couldn't be easily accessed. By tomorrow morning, the base should be uninhabitable. For now, they rested in the relative comfort of their tent, a little less than a mile from the base, stuffed into their sleeping bags, their combined body heat bringing the ambient temperature up to almost 50 degrees. John and Dieter bracketed Wendy, who'd eaten as quickly as she could and then crawled into her sack and dropped off to sleep instantly. Now she began to emit a cute little snore, and John smiled. She'll be all right, John. Dieter's voice rumbled from beside her. This is hard on her, but she doesn't want to fail you, and that will make her strong. I know, John whispered back. But thanks. After a moment, he asked, How are your hands? Slightly burned, Dieter answered. I don't know if it's from the cold or the chemicals, but it's nothing. John nodded once. Good. Dieter woke, instantly on guard. He lay there still, listening, alert for what he could learn in the darkness. The wind had come up and the tent frame creaked as it moved, sounding vaguely like stealthy footsteps. Beside him, Wendy and John breathed in the slow, steady cadence of those deeply asleep. None of these sounds was out of the ordinary. It had to have been something unusual that had wakened him. He was about to surrender to sleep again when a scent tickled his nostrils. Von Rossbach inhaled deeply and then recognized what he'd been smelling. Blood. He opened his eyes and looked at Wendy, though he couldn't see her. Perhaps the girl had begun her menstruation. It would explain why she'd been so weak today. Then he heard a soft sound outside the tent and what sounded like an animal's whine. Moving quietly, Dieter began to dress. It was easy to find his gear. Most of his clothes were in the sleeping bag with him. He put on his parka, then his boots, and last he extracted his handgun from one of the parka's many pockets and checked to make sure it wasn't frozen solid. He stood hunched over and looked at the two sleepers. Then he decided to let them rest. He must have heard some odd sound the weather was making, but it needed to be checked out, or he'd never get back to sleep. Dieter unzipped the tent flap and stepped into the freezing darkness, zipping it back up behind him. He cast a glance at the sky and his lips tightened. There was a storm coming, no doubt. It wasn't night dark by any means, but the thick clouds had made a deep twilight out of what should have been a sunny day. Dieter glanced at the watch on his sleeve. Sunny night, he corrected himself. The stiff wind had already numbed his face, so he tugged down the balaclava and flung up his hood, though he didn't tie it down. Ideally, he should also put on his goggles to protect his eyes from being burned by ultraviolet rays that no cloud could stop. Then he rejected the idea. They would turn twilight into full night, and he didn't plan to be out here that long. He looked around the hollow in which they'd pitched their dome-shaped tent. They'd backed it onto the highest wall of the depression to give it the best possible protection from the wind. He could see no sign that anyone besides them had been here in the last 1,000,000 years. Rising from his crouch, he headed for higher ground, meaning to circle the area once to confirm what he was sure he'd find out: that they were the only human beings around for a mile. Dieter reached the lip of the hollow and crouched down again, listening and looking around. The snow seemed to glow in the dim light, and he could make out the tracks the snowmobile and the sledge had made. But he saw nothing else. He stood and moved a careful 10 paces before crouching again. A gust of wind butted him like a linebacker, almost knocking him over. Glancing at the clouds again, he decided to be a little less careful. He wanted to be in the tent when the weather broke. The slope behind the tent was steep, and he used one hand to steady himself as he climbed. Then, off to his right, something caught his attention. It was a wide, dark line that seemed to glisten wetly. Not rocks, he thought. It seemed to be on top of the snow. He moved off to intersect the markings. It could be simply an optical illusion disguising an outcropping of soil covered with a thin sheet of ice. But when he reached the place, he thought not. Dieter looked around, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. Then he crouched down. Pulling out a small flashlight, he aimed it at the marks and frowned. Blood, he thought in astonishment. He'd smelled it, so he shouldn't be surprised, but something crashed into him from behind. The gun flew from his hand and went skittering across the snow. Before Dieter could recover, something huge swarmed over him. Something heavy enough to make his ribs creak as it drove the air from his lungs. Teeth-like needles sank into his shoulder, and he brought his fist up to slam it onto the thing's head. Offended, it rose up with a guttural cry, and von Rossbach managed to turn over before it slammed down again. A seal! He barely had time to bring his forearm up to block the thing's strike at his throat. The leopard seal's sharp teeth tore through the layers of heavy fabric as though they were gossamer, to sink into the vulnerable flesh beneath. It shook its head like a Doberman worrying its prey, its breath stinking of dead penguin and rotten fish. Flippers battered at him until Dieter's big fist struck the side of its small head like a pile driver. It let go with a little bark of surprise, falling back on its belly, and then rising up with its head swaying side to side like a cobra's. Dieter kicked its side with his free leg, and to his surprise, it flowed off of him. He pushed off and slid down the slope, away from the creature. He stared at it in wonder as he scrambled to regain his footing. What the hell was it doing here? From this lower angle, he could see that the animal's underbody was shredded by its travel over the ice. It must be half mad with hunger and pain. Which would certainly explain why it would attack me, but not what it was doing this far from the sea in the first place. To his horror, two other massive forms began to undulate towards him in the darkness. He looked around for the dropped gun, but couldn't find it. "John!" he shouted. And at that moment, the storm finally struck with an unearthly screech. Instantly, the world turned white, and the wind cut through his clothes as though they weren't there. He called out again, but couldn't hear his own voice over the screaming wind. Some instinct told him to move, and he sensed a heavy weight falling on the spot that he'd last been. He skittered from place to place, harried by the seals, blinded by the blowing snow. He dug for his belt and pulled out his hunting knife, feeling calmer for having a weapon in his hand. He tried to stand still, but the wind pushed at him, its icy breath numbing his face and hands and feet, freezing the skin over his entire body as it threatened to knock him off his feet again. A silvery head struck at his boot, and he stabbed it, the blade glancing off bone. The head was gone again, though the animal must have shaken it, since blood splashed his legs. Hot for a moment before it froze to cracking red ice. "I need to find shelter from the wind," von Rossbach thought, absurdly calm. Something at his back would also give him at least one direction from which the seals couldn't strike. The fact that they were twice as long as he was tall, mad as hell, and armed with formidable teeth, while he only had a knife, wasn't worth taking into consideration. Taking a chance, he crouched down, briefly tucking his hands into his armpits to warm them. If his hand went too numb, he could lose the knife without being aware of it. Dieter cursed himself for leaving his goggles behind. It felt as though his eyeballs were freezing. Suddenly, two shapes slightly darker than the rest of the white world loomed over him. Pushing himself backward with a mighty leap, Dieter allowed himself to fall. The two shapes followed, as though swimming through the snow. The fall continued for far too long, and the Austrian felt an icy thrill within. Crevasse! He thought in horror. Then struck, and the screaming whiteness turned to black.